When creating game levels, it can be a time saver to use a modular asset pack. While there are many available online for different game engines such as Unreal and Unity, there might be a point where you fancy creating your own modular asset set because you can't find an asset pack that meets your needs for various reasons. In this video we will look at using Blender 5 to create the building blocks of a modular asset set. We can broadly divide the assets into building parts and props, and this video is focused on the modular building parts that can be combined to create buildings to place in your level. We will not be looking at texturing assets, as these should be generic pieces that could be used as is or adapted for various settings. There are various decisions that we need to make when building a modular asset set. We need an idea of the dimensions of the components that we're going to make. These dimensions need to be realistic and fit in with our other game assets. This is where a human mannequin is useful for comparison. Alternatively, we can take a look at other asset packs to see whether there are any common dimensions that occur in these asset packs. The basic building units, for example of wall sections, is often 3 meters wide by 3 meters tall and has a thickness of approximately 20 centimeters or a similar size. We then need to consider what building blocks we need to construct for our modular asset pack. We need elements that are the size of our basic unit, and then elements that are either half the width or height, and possibly both. Let's say we're building an asset pack for modular buildings. Here we would need walls, doors and windows. These would then be complemented with floors, ceilings and roof elements. Blender is a really good 3D modelling tool, and we will start to create our asset pack with Blender version 5. This won't be a tutorial on Blender, but where appropriate I will mention useful keyboard shortcuts or tools that I'm using to build the modular assets. The number of different wall elements that are required will vary based on the type of asset pack that you are creating, but there will be some standard elements for a modular building asset pack. A basic single unit wall section is the first one that we will create. We need to be careful where we place the pivot point to allow the wall to snap into place precisely where we want to place it. In fact, the pivot points are a really important part of modular assets, as the elements need to be interchangeable so that buildings can be constructed using modular assets with minimum hassle. The whole point of the modular assets is to avoid having to eyeball how parts fit together. This will of course be less realistic than handcrafting each part of your building, but you will save time building a game level and there will be fewer assets for the game engine to work with at runtime. We start building our first wall section with a cube, and then go into edit mode and start to move the vertices around until we have them relative to our desired pivot point. This point is in the bottom left hand corner and the wall itself is on the outside. By this I mean that it does not take space out of the area inside the building. This will make sense when we put a few wall pieces together. Our first wall segment is pretty straightforward and has no embellishments on it. We can assign a basic material to this mesh so that we have a rough idea of the actual materials that we will apply to the different elements of any modular building. To illustrate how things fit together, we can duplicate this wall section using either Shift D or Ctrl+D, depending on whether we want a new object or a linked object. We can move the new element as part of the duplication process. For example, if we press X, then it is fixed to move along the X axis, and holding Ctrl will help snap to the grid. We then can rotate the wall if we want it to turn. Here we press R to rotate the mesh, then press Z to fix the rotation axis, and 90 will put the wall in the orientation that I want. We continue with this approach to create our desired wall layout, such as a basic square or rectangular building interior. There will be situations where you want a wall to move at right angles, but there's a possibility that you could get an overlap in the meshes. So to illustrate this, we duplicate our building and then we rotate by 90 degrees, minus 90 degrees, and now when we look at these two walls, we'll see that there is an issue with them overlapping. We can get around this if we make some other pieces where the ends, either one or both, have been moved so that they are sloped, which means that they no longer overlap with each other. So here I'm replacing those two wall sections with ones which no longer overlap, and therefore we don't have to worry about some potential issues with rendering where the engine would have to decide which piece needs to get priority. Of course, within the game engine you don't have to do this, it depends on your personal preferences. The wall structure currently looks slightly odd at the joins where we've got a gap which you'd likely have a vertical post in. So what I've done is created some posts that are 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters and 3 meters tall. These can be moved into place around the structure and rotated by 90 degrees in the Z-axis as required to fit them in place. We next consider adding floors and ceiling pieces to our asset set. These are pretty basic. All we require is a cube that is 3 meters by 3 meters and about 20 centimeters thick, but this time it's laid along the floor or the ceiling as opposed to the orientation we have with our walls. When we create a door, we need to start from a basic wall segment. We then need to get a cutter, which we will use to remove the section that we want to from our wall to allow the door to fit in. We do this by adding a modifier, and it's a Boolean modifier. We have to then select the object that we're going to remove. So here we've got our cutter and we move it into place in the wall. We can then hide the cutter to see what the shape is going to look like. This example, I've put it right down at ground level, but I'm going to move it up slightly so we've got a slight bit of the door frame that someone will need to step over. So the door itself is made up of a frame, and it's about 5 centimeters around each edge, and then the door itself is 2 frames, one on the inside, one on the outside, and the actual door object itself in the middle. At the moment it's just a basic cube, but you could replace that with something a bit fancier. The windows are made in a very similar fashion. We start with a wall segment, we then create a cutter in the dimensions of the window, we use a Boolean modifier to remove the space, and then the window itself is a frame on the outside and the window part on the inside. When creating a roof, we need to start off with the end sections, which are sloped. They're done here at a 45-degree angle, and we have a section for both the left hand and right hand side. We then need to have the roof sections that sit on top of these end parts. So we've got a 3 by 3 meter part underneath, and then a single section which is an extra 20 centimeters thick. Then we've got a half unit and a quarter unit. We then need to consider the endpoints. So we've got a corner point here, which is an extra 20 centimeters around the outside and fits at the edge where we've got a turn. We've then got the reverse for when we've got the wall going in an L shape. We then need to consider the lower parts that connect to the actual part of the roof. So we've got an overhang. So we've got one that fits the full half and quarter length. We have an L-shaped segment and then the corner shaped segment. We can then put all of these pieces together to create a basic example building. So at the bottom level we've got walls, and on the front where we have the door we have a single unit piece in the middle and then two half-size pieces to either side with windows in them. We've also got a horizontal pillar going across the lintel to make the building look slightly less boring, and then on top we got the upper and overhang pieces that make up the roof. So here all this has been put together using the modular assets that have been constructed for this task. So that covers a very basic look at creating modular game assets for building levels using Blender 5. These assets can then be exported to the Unreal Engine or Unity Engine as part of a game. The next step will be to create textures that work with these different components. These textures will be chosen based on the style that you're looking for. Also, we then might want to consider creating other modular components to handle different cases so we can generate a wider range of buildings.